Remember how I was just talking about the games with the Rogue Squadron formula putting the player in incredibly intense situations and they have to come up with good strategies in a limited amount of time? Well, Dead Man's Basin in Lair is the epitome of that. Now, from a game design perspective, this is actually a really impressive level, and I respect it a lot. However, it does have the capacity to drive me crazy. This is one of the most intense, stressful, and demanding things I have ever experienced in a video game. To provide some context so that this level makes sense at all to those who haven't played it, spoiler warning, the game's plot focuses heavily on the conflict between the Assylian and Mokai nations. You start off defending Assylia from the Mokai, but upon further exposure, you learn that the Assylian government is slowly being taken over by a religious figure called the Diviner, using the people's fears to gain more power and to justify his intent to wipe out the Mokai people, who it turns out are just heavily oppressed people trying to do their best to survive and defend themselves. Even with that, the game goes out of its way to present this in a very grey manner, instead of as black and white as many other sources of media portray this kind of plotline, which I actually find to be very admirable. In this level, after you free Kobakai, who is the son of the deceased Mokai general Atakai, you return to the desert where the Mokai have been hiding after their homes have been bombed. By you. Once there, it appears that the Assylian forces are trying to take out all Mokai that remain from every front imaginable. Dragons are attacking them from the air, the Assylian army is marching their way to them on ground with the only defense being a much smaller amount of Mokai troops. There are war beasts coming for them as well, and then the Assylian navy is catapulting projectiles at them from the sea as they try to get to higher ground. There is a lot of stuff going on in this level, and thankfully, the game makes sure you're fully aware of what's going on at all times, and it also introduces each thing individually and allows you to focus on one at a time before multiple things start happening at once. When that happens, you really have to think about what you need to do, when you need to do it, and prioritize which objectives are more important given the Mokai's current state. All before Manta bombers come in and you have to break the dam. It's a very well put together level, but you're really going to have to shift your brain into maximum overdrive if you ever want to beat this, which is something that a lot of gamers don't want to do anymore for some reason. Regardless, it's very evident that the designers knew how frustrating this level was going to be. Not so much in a Clyde and Caldera way, but in the sense that the payoff for beating it is incredibly strong. One of the things that Factor 5 does better than pretty much any other gaming studio is escort missions, and I highly doubt that anyone would argue with me on that. We've all heard rants about how universally bad they supposedly are, but oddly enough, Factor 5 has made a ton of really good ones, and I rarely ever hear people complain about them. In fact, I can't think of any good escort mission outside of a Factor 5 game. I'm sure one exists, and I might have played it, but it's just not coming to mind. However, I definitely say that Strike at the Core from Rogue Leader is by far their worst escort mission. You play as Wedge covering Lando and the Millennium Falcon over the surface and through the interior of the second Death Star in orbit of the forest moon of Endor. Now for the most part, this level is fairly well handled. The Millennium Falcon is able to fly through the interior without hitting anything and is able to evade obstacles. The graphics are very pretty for the GameCube, and the enemies fly toward the Millennium Falcon in clear patterns that you can prepare for in advance given prior experience earlier in the level and by looking at the radar. However, this level has just one crucial flaw. The Millennium Falcon can be destroyed very, very quickly. I swear, you cannot leave this thing alone for even a few seconds. The worst part is that this is the Millennium Falcon we're talking about. Hey Lando, this ship has quad guns, you know. Just tell your weird little laughing friend to go use them and take care of any ships behind it. In fact, let's see. I'm just going to let the TIE fighters get Lando and see how long it takes. Why didn't you use the quad guns? Now, I shouldn't be too hard on this, as Factor 5 had to make this game in just under 9 months, and it's mind-blowing how good the game is overall with that taken into consideration. It would easily take 18 months for any other development team at the time. Even ignoring that, the game still holds up, and for the most part is very polished. It is held up better than most of the other games in that generation in that regard. However, it admittedly does have a few points in time where the time constraints show. Though, even with that said, I still find myself playing this level. Not so much for the escort mission, but for what follows. The destruction of the main reactor and the escape portions of the mission are an absolute blast. And I have never seen a Star Wars game handle these scenes better. It's that good, which makes the aforementioned frustration worth it. Just barely, though. You probably weren't expecting me to put a moment for my favorite game this high on the list, now were you? Well, anyone who has played this game all the way through knows exactly what I'm talking about. While I'd argue that this game has the best difficulty curve in the series on the grounds that it introduces you to the game mechanics and strategy-focused gameplay through the game design itself very gradually early on, there are a couple of major difficulty spikes near the end. This is one of the most infamous: Escape from Fest. In this level, Rebel Commandos tried to abscond 3 ATPTs from an Imperial research facility. However, they got caught and are currently trying to flee. As a result, you're going to be protecting them from AT-AT walkers, a whole swarm of tanks, and TIE bombers. Now, these ATPTs take significantly more time to blow up than Lando and the Millennium Falcon for some inexplicable reason. In fact, I think that this level is significantly better overall than Strike at the Core, even though it's more frustrating. However, you have to protect them from a whole lot more, and you're really going to have to be on top of things. There's this huge underlying sense of tension that upon replaying, I find myself adoring. But for first-time players, this is going to be some really intense shit. You really get the sense that this huge, massive military power is going out of its way to destroy the small rebel movement that you're a part of. This feeling is very consistent throughout the game itself, but this takes that to a whole new extreme, and seeing how hard the level is in relation to the levels before and after it, that guaranteed it a spot on this list. Now, most of the entries on this list had a strong payoff to compensate for the frustration, giving you a sense that it was all worth it. This is something that Factor 5 does often, and does very well. However, here's where things get almost too insane, even by Factor 5 standards. The times where you actually feel kind of ripped off. To make things even more bizarre, the next 2 entries are from some of my favorite games, not just from the studio, but in general as well. For example, Super Turrican on the Super Nintendo is absolutely amazing. Easily my favorite game on the system, and the Super Nintendo is one of my favorite consoles, so that's really saying something. However, there's one platforming challenge that I just can't stand. To provide some background, there's one part in Turrican 2 where you find a fluctuating air current and you have to time your jumps with the point in time where the current is at its strongest so you can reach the higher jumps. This was an interesting platforming challenge that helped add variety and change the pace. Then Super Turrican did the same thing in the last level of the Snow World, and that's exactly what I'm talking about here. In the section in Turrican 2, the wind started from the bottom and headed straight up. Here it comes from a variety of directions, so there's more to process. To add to this, the jumps are much trickier than those in Turrican 2. Then add ice physics. Add all of this together, and you get pure rage. It's not even that long a section, but chances are you'll be stuck at the bottom trying to work yourself up, but find yourself unable to do so until you get lucky, and then not so lucky as you plummet back to the bottom again. It's especially odd to see this when seeing just how good the rest of the platforming is. I understand what they were going for here, and usually adding something from Turrican 2 is a plus, but I feel that this was just way too much. However, the real question is, what's number 1? You know how I was talking about the couple of infamous difficulty spikes in the original Rogue Squadron? This is the other one. Raid on Sullust. This is the level that drives everybody insane. No, virtually everyone who has played this game makes fun of how insane this level is. It's very much the water temple of Rogue Squadron, just going off of reputation alone. Yeah, am I the only one who found Under the Realm far more annoying? Anyways, I'm getting off topic. Like with Dead Man's Basin, I'm going to need to talk about the game's story so this level makes sense at all. The leader of the Imperial 128th TIE Interceptor Squadron, Kaysen Moore, defects to the Rebel Alliance due to her changing views on the Empire after the destruction of Alderaan. She gives the initially skeptical Rogue Squadron intel on various Imperial installations. While it wouldn't give the Rebel Alliance the upper hand immediately, destroying these will help them gradually turn the tide of the Galactic Civil War. However, her old mentor, Moff Cole Searden, hears of this and decides to enact a plan to wipe out the Rebel Alliance. He wants to wipe out the Rebels' Bacta supplies, which will render their medical supplies useless. That way, even the wounded are as good as dead. He also has an obsession with Rogue Squadron, even more than I do, which should be an immediate warning sign. He has studied their formations, strategies, and actions obsessively, and the fact that his former pupil is now a member of Rogue Squadron is only fueling his obsession even more. After encountering him trying to bombard his own planet, our next mission finds us at Sullust. The objective is deceptively simple. To destroy an initially shielded capacitor, in order to take the shield down, you'll need to destroy various transmitters around the volcano floor. Now, one of the variants of turbo laser towers in this game is a missile turret, and you'll encounter them throughout the game. When one of these missile turrets locks onto you, it'll make this noise. So without further ado, here's unedited gameplay footage of Raid on Sullust. There are missile turrets everywhere. Evidently, the strategy in this level comes from an entirely different source than that of the prior levels. Instead of responding to various objectives within a limited amount of time, you're given a less time-sensitive objective where the strategy comes from trying to survive. I actually think that's a really good idea, but it could have been done better, and I would like to see another attempt if there ever is another Rogue Squadron game. The fact that this level is insanely difficult, even when piloting the highly shielded Y-Wing, is horrifying. It has been commonly stated that there are two types of people who beat this level. People who use a cheat code, which is appropriately named I Give Up, or those who play the game way too much.
Guess who falls under the latter category?
The trick is to stay close to the ground, but not too close so you can avoid the lava and bomb the transmitters. While close to the ground, take out all of the missile turrets and then bomb the transmitters before taking out the capacitor. As always in Rogue Squadron, if you exercise your observational skills effectively, even the hardest of scenarios can be made much simpler.
Be smart! Be victorious!
So if that's the case, why is this number one? Just watch.
Let's get out of here before the volcano destabilizes.
Rogue Squadron, I'm afraid you'll have to cut your celebration short. Moff Searden has begun his attack on Cyphera.
He used us. This was all a diversion.
This was all a diversion? This was all a diversion?
This was all a diversion.
Yes, this was a trap set up by Moff Searden, just so he can have an opportunity to take out the rebels' Bacta supplies, which carries over into the next mission. That is so underhanded and yet simultaneously not surprising. However, after going through one of the hardest levels in a very hard game, this was all pointless. The thing you want to hear?
No!
The only way I could find this being even more frustrating is if they pulled a sanctuary on us and called this level Happy and Tranquil Noises of Peace. I still don't think that this level is bad per se, But when I hear people make that claim, I don't really argue. I can see exactly what they're talking about, because suddenly I've developed an extreme fear of missile chart sounds and the word diversion. Still, even with a couple of questionable moments, should that taint my view of otherwise amazing games from an otherwise unbelievable studio? Of course not! Something that I've been told a lot in both a positive and negative context individually is that I hold video games to a very high standard. A lot of that comes from my exposure to these games. I am excited to see gaming evolve as a medium, and I want to see where it goes. But even with that, it's amazing to see just how ahead of the game Factor 5 was, as it's very debatable that game developers now have a lot of catching up to do. However, like with any body of work, there are things to model after and expand upon, and things to avoid.